Uh, Welcome to the 81st class. We have, as I've mentioned several times, two more classes. And so I think you're going to enjoy the content of all of these. The title of tonight's talk probably doesn't sound exciting to most people because it's dealing with the plans and the evolution of the administrative order and so on. But in fact, I would like to remind you of the Guardian statement that I will read on the first slide about to dissociate the administrative order from the humanitarian principles of the faith, the spiritual principles, which we like to think of as the heart of the faith, is to mutilate the cause and ultimately to destroy the Baha'i Faith. The slides tonight presents a story, even as the next two classes will as well. Tonight's story is how the teaching plans evolved from really from the tablets of the divine plan, where you already had local assemblies established and you had plentiful guidance to those assemblies by or from Abdu'l-Baha. So as I've said many times in the past, if we look at those compilations on how to run an LSA or have a feast, many of the letters and much of the guidance is from Abdu'l-Baha. So what you have is basically a sort of static condition in the Baha'i faith at the local level from the time of Abdu'l-Baha almost for 100 years. And this is why when suddenly these teaching plans changed, all of a sudden in 2001, really it began before that. And we're going to discuss how they changed and why they changed and what an incredible significant turning point this is in the teaching of the faith. And while some people may like the concept of a parlor religion, of course, as I've told you before, people like Mirza Mabsorab, who was a covenant breaker, who rejected the idea of even needing an administrative order. Why do we need an administrative order? We've got the teachings of Baha'u'llah, we've got a religion, we pray, and so on. Wanted to get away from administration, and considering the history of religion and how religious administration has virtually destroyed most of the heart of the religion that was brought by the founders, you can appreciate why. So let me begin with the title of tonight's talk, Teaching Plans, Systematic Global Development of the Faith. And of course, next week we will trace another plot, and there are plots in each of these last three classes. They're stories, if you will. And I'm going to try to show you how the story is set out, what the climax is, and how they end. And of course, the climax or the end of this story is right where we are now, beginning another epoch in both the history and in the teaching of the Baha'i Faith with the 9-year plan. And then with the next week, we will the story of how do we get from where we are and where we've been since the beginning of the formative age in 1921 until we get to the climax of the formative age, which would be the establishment of a global commonwealth. But that's only that's not the end of the story, and that will be in the last class. How do we get from the establishment of a global commonwealth to the world order Baha'u'llah, which are two distinct things? And here is the passage I was just referring to. To dissociate the administrative principles of the cause from the purely spiritual and humanitarian teachings would be tantamount to a mutilation of the body of the cause, a separation that can only result in the disintegration of its component parts and the extinction of the faith itself. In this most recent, well, it's not my most recent book now. My other one has come out, and as I showed you last time, The Body of God, the examination of the Suri Hakel, is now available not only through the ABS Association and the Publishing Trust, but also on Amazon. But this is a book I wrote about the story, the plot that I'm going to outline for you tonight. How God's plan for planet Earth is being worked out one chapter at a time. So as we discussed last week, we have these various terms to designate various lengths of history and various categories of history. So we have ages, epoch, stages, all that have led us to where we are now, the beginning of a new epoch, the 9-year plan, which is the third epoch in the tablets of in the teaching plans that are under the auspices of the tablets of the divine plan, and the sixth epoch in Baha'i history. So the terminology, as we said last time, you've got the cycle, Baha'i cycle, which is the cycle following many other cycles, most of which have been lost to human memory because of the records have been destroyed. But the first one we are aware of with any coherence, though we have evidence of other cycles in other parts of the world, is the Adamic or prophetic cycle, which ends with the advent of the Bab. And as I said last week, that's why that's one of the meanings of Muhammad as the seal of the prophet. He's the last prophet of those manifestations who prophesied the advent of the Day of Days, the turning point in human history, which is singular and unique. Now, there are many turning points in human history yet to come, and many that have already come. This is a particularly profound one that never has occurred before and never will again, and that is where we go from lesser governmental entities to a global governmental entity. And of course, the Guardian calls this the maturation of humankind. We go, of course, right now we're sort of at the tail end of our adolescence, and it shows because we're doing as a world community adolescent things, quarreling with each other, killing each other, so on. Then a lesser ingredient of time, so the Baha'i cycle will endure not less than 500,000 years. The Baha'i era will last at least 1,000 years. We know that because Baha'u'llah said, don't look for another manifestation for another 1,000 years, or if anyone claims to be a manifestation before that amount of time has elapsed, they are erroneous, and God will send someone to deal mercilessly with them, though if they disclaim this, they will be forgiven. And so in even more confined time period, you have ages within the era. And so far we've had, of course, the heroic age. The formative age will still end. It began in 1921. We don't know when it will end. And then the golden age, which we don't know when it began, but we know that it may end as soon as 2844. Now that would be 1,000 years that Baha'u'llah is referring to. So it could be that early, but it could be a lot longer. We don't know when it will end. We just know it will last at least that long. And as I said last week, it's kind of shocking when you think that approximately a fifth of that time has already occurred. So while these events that we've been waiting for so long, such as the formation of the Lesser Peace and succeeded by the Golden Age, they may not be as far off as we think. So you have the epochs of Baha'i history. As I said, the present one that we're just beginning is the sixth epoch. And then you have the epochs in the divine plan, and we're just beginning the third of those. So I wanted to show you, first of all, those two demarcations. First, the historical epochs. So you can see right here, we're beginning in 2021. 2022 with the second century and the, as it said down here, a new series of global plans that mark the sixth epoch, the beginning of the sixth epoch in history. And then you have the teaching plans, all that have occurred so far. Now, these aren't all equal. Some of these are much more important than others. And of course, the one we've talked about the most, and that is the most critical, was the last one, the Guardian, or at least the most critical up till now. So you have sort of a highlight here with the 10-year World Crusade from here to here. And then you had a succession of plans here. And one particularly important is this 9-year plan that followed the 10-year World Crusade. So let me show you what I'm talking about so far as how this works out as a story or a plot or the logical sequence of it. First of all are the tablets of the divine plan themselves. There are 14 of them. And you can, by clicking on these links, if you download the slides, they go directly to those particular parts of them, though, of course, the tablets of the divine plan are available in a single collection and available through the publishing trust as well. But it's interesting to see all the cities and areas that are mentioned by Abdu'l-Baha in this plan. Another book that, and again, some of this you might find, well, that's not worth, that's past now. I need to focus on the plan that's governing us right now. And that's true to a certain extent. But in a wonderful book that was put together by Paul Lample in 1993 with Leilani Smith, this was before he was elected to the House of Justice, over 10 years before. But it's very valuable because in it does sort of a Rui book with the various plans and what the plans are. But for example, in the first epoch, you have two plans, the first 7-year plan and the second 7-year plan. These were the first plans that were created after the divine plan by the Guardian. And what they do in this study is they show the plan, the dates they were meant to cover, the objectives of the plan as stated in the documents describing the plan. You've got what the outcomes were. Were they accomplished? And yes, they were. And you'll see that all of the plans succeeded. Most all of the goals were reached and surpassed in most of the plans. And these are references where you'll find discussions of these plans. And then there were other national plans. Now, this is important that you understand that we're talking about both global plans, and then we're talking about plans that were specific to particular countries, as you can see here. Then came the 10-year World Crusade, 53 through 63. The purpose, of course, was to construct the pillars of the House of Justice. And that is, the plan was at the end of this to elect the House of Justice. This was the Guardian's purpose, and that purpose was carried out under the guidance of the custodians. And so there was incredible outflowing of pioneers throughout the world to establish, at least open the countries and try to establish as many national spiritual assemblies as possible. As I've said before, because the more pillars you have, the more sturdy the edifice is at the when you are electing the House of Justice, the more electors you have. And those who opened new territories, the first Baha'is in a territory, were designated as Knights of Baha'u'llah. You've probably, some of you have met some in your lifetime, have known them, wonderful people. So this was the major goal of the 10-year World Crusade. And the accomplishments were that the number of NSAs became 56 in number, which, considering I think you had 11 at the with the end of Abdu'l-Baha's ministry. You had the election of the House of Justice, and you had the First World Congress to celebrate that. So that's the first epoch, going through 63, from 1937 to 63. The second epoch is important for a whole bunch of reasons. This really is almost like it would make a good drama. And here's, let me see if I can explain to you why. And I explain it, I think, more clearly in my book, God's Plan for Planet Earth, to show how it develops. But it goes something like this. First, you had the 9-year plan. And very important things happened in the 9-year plan, such as the Constitution of the House of Justice was devised. And towards the end of it, in the early 70s, and maybe some of you participated in this, I did, and it was a remarkable event. You had mass teaching, which had been touted as a goal for so long, and still is. Actually, we saw it become a reality. Now, it had become a reality in some places in Africa and South America and so on before this. But in the United States, this was the first evidence you had of successful mass teaching. You literally had the whole distribution of Baha'is changed completely. This occurred primarily, first of all, in South Carolina. This was among people who lived in the rural areas of South Carolina, and there were mostly African Americans. And they welcomed the faith as if they had been waiting for it their whole lives, and indeed more than their lives. It was an expectation that had been borne out in the prophecies of their religions that they had brought with them, and also their adopted religion of Christianity, which dwells quite strongly, of course, on the advent of the Day of Days and the resurrection, the new day coming, so on. Some of the what are called Negro spirituals, and that's not an inappropriate use of the term, even though it's out of acceptance now. These songs among the slave songs are still called that. And many of them allude to this very event, this world-changing event. It would be a lovely thing to study the references in those to the advent of what we know as the Baha'i Faith, but what was considered the Day of Days, the resurrection, which of course was not meant to be taken literally, but figuratively. Mankind is asleep, and now they are awakened. The reviewing of the methodology employed became necessary within a year or two, because you had thousands of Baha'is coming in But what you did not have was any infrastructure at the grassroots level to help these people learn, okay, I'm a Baha'i, what do I do now? Well, you elect an assembly. How do we elect an assembly? And so on. Now, who was left behind? You had teaching teams going from city to city, from area to area. And once they had enrolled people, the tendency was, okay, you're Baha'is, and they would go to another area. And on the one hand, it was an exciting thing to do. I was on the district teaching committee for Florida, and a member of the committee called me when I was out of town and said, John, we've got to have a meeting immediately. You've got to come down to Naples, Florida. I said, why? He said, because we have just doubled the number of Baha'is in Florida. Well, I knew how many Baha'is there were in Florida because I did the newsletter for all the Baha'is in Florida, and there were approximately 1,200 Baha'is in Florida. This is prior to this teaching. So we doubled that number within a month. And Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina exceeded those numbers. But what did we do then? So the problem then became to go find these people and teach them what they do now. And so we went into, now this occurred in the 70, 72 through 74. So there were incredible expectations of what would happen with the next plan, the 5-year plan. And to kick it off, because we now had incredible resources financially and insofar as population was concerned. And so a celebration was held in Kiel Auditorium in St. Louis. Over 10,000 Baha'is gathered, and all of the luminaries, Seals and Croft, England Dan and John Ford Coley, Dan Seals, and Bill Sears was there. It was an incredible experience. It really was. As you can imagine, it was on a weekend, and we were in a part of downtown St. Louis that wasn't that highly populated. So almost everybody on the street was a Baha'i. So you got a sense of what it would be like to live in a city where everybody you meet is a Baha'i. And so we were all excited because we thought this was going to continue the way it had gone for a couple of years. But what happened almost immediately was that we realized, and I've told you this story before, and I won't go into detail now, but as the secretaries in these communities received 100 or 200 declaration cards, then who was supposed to go get in touch with and teach these people? Well, you had 9 people in an assembly, and in some cases you had only maybe 2 or 3 more Baha'is in the community. How were they supposed to teach all of these new Baha'is? And so they did the best they could, but it was difficult. And of course, there was also the problem that back then it was very stringent about the rules. We had for, again, almost 100 years run LSAs very strictly. And to have someone declare in the faith meant that the LSA had to meet with them to be sure they knew what they were doing. And then the declaration card would be countersigned and sent to the National Assembly. Well, some of the secretaries said, well, I can't send these cards in. They aren't countersigned because the person who brought them into the faith, I don't know where they are. They've gone off somewhere else to teach. So there was that. And then there was ultimately the problem that the main thing that was learned from this part of the story is you can't mandate grassroots change from above. So in other words, we had this great gathering in St. Louis kicking off the 5-year plan to continue the same thing, but we didn't have an infrastructure. And even if we had had an infrastructure, we didn't have a plan on how to teach these people. We didn't have classes We didn't have, so we had individuals go out and try to hold, for example, I and another Baha'i went to Gainesville and invited all the people in the Gainesville, Florida area. There were many of them. There were hundreds of them. And only 5 people showed up. Why? Because what we didn't realize is they didn't have cars. They weren't about to go somewhere they didn't know anything about. You had to teach them in their own communities. And of course, now you're beginning to see how the plot thickens as the House of Justice is observing this and thinking about this. And so what worked was direct teaching. Street teaching, it was called, direct teaching, door-to-door teaching. That worked because we were in the neighborhood of the people we were teaching. What did not work was we didn't live in that neighborhood, and they had no facilities, and they had no teachers, and they had no courses to learn from. So what lessons were learned was we needed to have an infrastructure before we taught them. There was even a thought that went something like, if you teach someone and then leave them alone, you were actually doing them harm because you were giving them this wonderful gift and then sort of snatching it away. And yet we found that when we did get some infrastructure and we did get teams of people going back to these places, sometimes 5, 10 years later, they were still Baha'is, they were getting their Baha'i news, and some of the strongest Baha'is you'll ever meet were those who held on. So in the meanwhile, the House of Justice is beginning to realize, and this is not an authoritative statement, this is my guesstimation based on what happened, what emerged from this, was that resources must emanate from the local community, from the ground up, that you can legislate, I shouldn't say legislate, you can mandate things to happen, but it's the local level where it has to happen. Now, there's another part of this plot that some of you may be old enough to remember, and that is how these plans were disseminated to the individual. The plans from the House of Justice first went to the World Teaching Committee, and formally you had the overall objectives spelled out, but it was up to each national teaching committee, which was appointed by the NSAs, to come up with the means, the strategies where you would get these objectives achieved. Well, so here's the sequence in time. You have your national convention, you elect your NSA appoints a new national teaching committee. You're now into the, of course, you have the Rizwan elections at the end of April. Now you're into May. And then the national teaching committees have to get together and formulate strategies. They then deliver the message. Usually members of the teaching committee would go around the country and explain how this would work so that the local spiritual assemblies, who had usually teaching committees, would then translate their instructions into what would work in their community. It's now because you have what was used to call the summer letdown, and that is people would go on vacation and so on. It would now be around September when the local teaching committees would have the plans devised for the community and get them going. It sort of was in sync with the school year, and indeed Baha'i clubs, colleges were one of the main places where really good teaching took place. So each community carried out its own methodology. But what was it to do? In other words, that's all it had was objectives. It didn't have any particular means of doing it. And so you'd have county fairs and presentation, Baha'i clubs. Each LSA had to figure, well, what can we do in our community? So by the time, let's put it this way, simply, by the time you had action going and teaching taking place, maybe half the year was already gone. And so that was another reason that numbers began to dwindle from many of those who had come into the faith, because we couldn't find them, we couldn't get in touch with them, and it was very discouraging. It was particularly discouraging, if I may say, for those stalwart members of LSAs who were faced with the task of having these hundreds of declarations in their community, knowing that they were real people that really lived somewhere, but not having the resources to get in touch with them. And when they did get in touch with them, what were they to do? They didn't have any specific guidance. So then you have this problem, the fireside versus street teaching and direct teaching. You go back to the fireside, which is nothing wrong with it whatsoever. It's still encouraged. It's still a wonderful way to teach. You invite your neighbors, you invite your friends, and you discuss some aspect of the faith. There are many that went on for decades in the same homes. And so that's indirect teaching. And then you had direct teaching, street teaching, which could go on simultaneously in the community. But there was a lot of people who felt that, well, this seems like you're imposing on someone, you're proselytizing. And so you had these long discussions between about the difference between proselytizing and direct teaching. What is the difference? Well, of course, the difference is very simple. Proselytizing is trying to coerce someone. Direct teaching is simply telling someone as much as they want to know. It's a matter of your attitude. It's a matter of how you present the faith. And so you kind of still have the parlor religion concept. And what is meant by that? Well, on the one hand, it was kind of comforting. You would have maybe 15, 20, at most 30 people in a community. And I'm talking about majority of communities. And so you would have your feast, you would have a fireside, you would have holy day celebrations and so on. But they would be held mostly in people's homes. And so you would rotate the feasts from one house to another. People would volunteer to have them. And some people had little apartments with one room, one little parlor, and everybody would be crowded together. So you can understand the problem. We had no centers, and we were trying to, we still had in mind a kind of structure that had now endured for almost 100 years. But it was no longer an appropriate structure. I remember vividly, and this was just before the clusters were developed and we began the series of 5-year plans. We had just made an assembly in a small town in Florida. And it was made because a young African-American and his wife had just joined the community and they were of age. And so we had enough to form an assembly. So we met and did our agenda as we usually did. And the young man at the end of what seemed to be a very good LSA meeting says, "Is this it? Is this all we do?" And he wasn't being sarcastic. He really wanted to know. And we said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, how does this change the world?" In effect, he knew that the goal of the faith was to bring the unity of humankind. And so his experience was, we have feast, we have LSA meetings, we meet. What's changing? What are we doing to change the world? Well, here's where a significant change occurred. And this has to do with the 4-year plan and the 12-month plan. These were plans in 1996 and then the 12-month plan, 1920 to 21, where the House of Justice had already figured out before these started what needed to happen. What needed to happen was to create the cluster system and come up with a curriculum, the institute process. So they were planning this, and so to get started with the 4-year plan, we had the establishment of the regional councils. Well, at the time, we didn't know what they were. We just knew that the people on LSAs were to elect them, but the regional council had no authority over the LSAs. Well, of course, what they were set up to do is to oversee the development of the agencies in the clusters, particularly the institute, institute courses and the institute itself. But we didn't know that. So the strategic purpose would become clearly unfolded in the next plan, and that was the 12-month plan of preparation. Now, another change that occurs here is that where before the House of Justice would give the objectives and goals to the NSAs, but leave it up to the NSAs to decide how to carry it out. Now the House of Justice, in association with and collaboration with the World Teaching Center, created the specifics of the plan. Here is specifically what you must do. And at the grassroots level, we are going to divide the world of the Baha'i Faith into clusters. Each cluster will have cluster agencies, and those agencies will do 3 things, and those 3 things turned into 4 things. And this was the children's classes, the junior youth and spiritual empowerment programs, the institute courses that I already mentioned those, and the devotionals. So children's classes, junior youth animation programs, institute classes, and devotions. These were the core activities that were to take place, but they weren't just to take place. You had this core of individuals at the cluster level who would meticulously take statistical accounts of how many of these were occurring and where, who had passed what level, of course, until they became tutors. And once they became tutors, they would teach, and so on. So this was panned out in the greatest detail, and it became ever more refined as it went along. So this was extensive change at the local level. Suddenly, the parlor religion was gone, and you had a cluster. And so you had another problem. Every time you have change and you make a step forward, you have resistance or you have fear because you don't know what's happening. And so suddenly you had these clusters and you had LSAs, and who was first? In other words, could the cluster take over the teaching from the LSA? Did it need the permission of the LSA, and so on? Well, this became worked out little by little, so that you knew that the LSAs worked in collaboration with the clusters and the cluster groups. And this is a definition of the cluster. A cluster is an area with borders designated by Baha'i institutions that take into account geographic, social, and economic factors. They exist in all countries where the faith is permitted to operate. The purpose of the clusters is to allow plans for systematic growth to be formulated on a manageable scale. The Universal House of Justice has outlined 3 conceptual milestones of growth. Now, this is later on. This was in the last couple of 5-year plans, where you have the milestone, the concept of a cluster going through its own growth. And you had 3 milestones, which were 3 levels of activity to classify the clusters. And you have, of course, the map that came out on every Baha'i month that would show you all of the clusters in the United States and what level those clusters were out, and we still have those maps. So we established these programs of growth. We established the core group that we talked about last week that consisted of the ABM, the assistants, the core institute coordinator or the institute courses, the core children's classes coordinator, the junior group coordinator, and the area teaching committee, and then devotional directors too. And so you've seen this many times. I've showed it to you before, but now you see that suddenly you have the logic of the whole thing. So you have the administrative order giving instructions through here, assisted by those in those instructions here. So instead of just having information go up here and come down here, it's going back and forth here, and then back and forth here. Because even though it doesn't show it here, I may show it later, even though it doesn't show it here, the counselors are above spiritual assemblies in authority. The auxiliary boards are above the regional councils and the local assemblies. This is just an authority, and it rarely comes into play because the idea is you have assistance and collaboration here. So the counselors meet with the national assemblies. They still do on a constant basis. So you had the cluster, and notice what this does. It doesn't leave out the non-Baha'is. They're part of the cluster. It doesn't leave out the isolated believers, the individual Baha'is who may not be in a community. The registered groups are now part of a larger entity. So that was the idea. It's not an administrative body. It's a teaching agency that's overseen and helped by the the Regional Training Institute board of directors, which is overseen by the National Spiritual Assembly. So what are the 3 milestones? The first milestone, in a letter to the Conference of Continental Boards of Counselors dated 28 December 2010, the Universal House of Justice described a possible sequence of events which was summed up as follows. That is to say, in whatever combination and however small in number, devotional gatherings, children's classes, and junior youth groups are being maintained by those progressing through the sequence of institute courses and committed to the vision of individual and collective transformation they foster. This initial flow of human resources into the field of systematic action marks the first of several milestones in a process of sustainable growth. Sustainable growth. And notice how different that is from what you had when you had these teaching teams come through, find Baha'is, that is, people who were Baha'is and didn't know it, people who declared, but no process for sustainable growth or sustaining them. So that's the first milestone. A new program of growth begins as 2 nascent capacities develop. First, 1 or more friends in a cluster must be able to help individuals study the Institute's sequence of courses and accompany them as they initiate core activities. Because the core activities, of course, another thing we realized, and that's a whole story. That's a story I tell in that book I showed you up front. We went from seeing some idea of the core activities as sort of, well, somebody else is doing this. I'm taking Rui Book 1, Rui Book 2, and so on. But each of those books, as most of you well know, were to end in a series of actions. So it was knowledge in action, not just knowledge. You weren't just learning the concepts, though the concepts were very well developed and so on, the fundamental concepts of the Baha'i Faith. Then these individuals must be able to attract others to participate in the core activities. As efforts along these lines have borne fruit in various parts of the world, the institutions concerned set aside exaggerated expectations of what must be achieved before a new program of growth can be said to have emerged. Although by no means definitive, it is now understood that a cluster with about 5 or more core activities, and they're not the same activities, notice, it can be a combination of, say, 3 children's classes and 2 devotionals, whatever, can be seen to have established a program of growth and passed the first milestone. So these were not rigidly enforced, but they helped the oversight of the programs so that the NSA could look at a map of the United States, say, which is a very complex community, and look at one glance, see, okay, we've got this many clusters at a 3rd milestone, they can help do this, or we can send people to study there, how it's working, and so on. You could see, in other words, you weren't just going by numbers of adherents to the faith. You were going by activity, by action, to assess what was happening and where and to what extent. The second milestone, in a letter to the Conference of the Continental Boards of Counselors dated 28 December 2010, the Universal House of Justice described a combination of events which was summed up as follows. A steady stream of friends is proceeding through the courses of training institute and engaging in the corresponding activities, which serves in turn to increase the number of fresh recruits into the faith, a significant percentage of whom invariably enters the institute process, guaranteeing the expansion of the system. This constitutes another milestone that the friends laboring in every cluster must in time reach. Clusters with 20 or more core activities are usually working at a level of intensity that they can be considered to have passed the second milestone and thus have an intensive program of growth. And then the third milestone, the letter from the House of Justice, 29 December 2015, so this is 5 years later into the next 5-year plan, gives a very full description of what a cluster which has reached the third milestone would look like. Successive paragraphs deal with different aspects. The believers encounter receptivity within distinct populations. Many, for example, say in California would, I say many, some teachers would move into a Hispanic barrio community and would set up a center and so on. Greater demands are being placed on the organizational scheme of the training institute. The area teaching committee is rising to a new level of functioning. The local spiritual assembly is enhancing its capacity. And here is where, again, you have not this conflict between the two or a confusion between the two, but you have the collaboration of the assembly. The assembly, you see, is not a teaching body. That's one of its main goals, certainly, but it's learning now more and more to be a body of governance. A mode of learning permeates the whole community, and there are stirrings of social action. The House of Justice continues. For the movement of a population to have come this far demonstrates that the process which brought it about is strong enough to achieve and sustain a high degree of participation in all aspects of the capacity building endeavor and manage the complexity entailed. This is another milestone for the friends to pass, the third in succession since the process of growth in a cluster was begun. So as we conclude tonight, you see there are lots of stories there where we talked really about 3 different plots, if you will, or stories to tell, where you have a beginning, a problem, then the problem is overcome, and we learn more and we learn more. And now as we begin the 9-year plan, we're still talking of clusters. But what we're emphasizing more in the guidance from the House of Justice and the World Teaching Center is the inclusion of the non-Baha'i population. This isn't new. This was emphasized in the last 5-year plan as well. But more and more, we're less concerned with numbers of people who sign cards or who formally commit to being Baha'is, and more concerned with building literal communities from the ground up, because they certainly don't exist in the secular world anymore. I remember a time back in the 40s and the 50s when they did, even though they were segregated, you still had a sense of community. That's mostly gone now. And so it is up to us to not rebuild those communities, but a totally different kind of community based on gathering together for the betterment of the people in the community and for spiritual goals as well as secular and strategic goals. Raising capacity for administration at all levels. Feed the fires. What I'm talking about here is what is interesting, and I'm sure you've noticed this yourself, that attention and resources go where teaching is occurring. So who ever heard of Vanuatu before the teaching just blossomed there? You have, of course, the first national houses of worship, continental houses of worship. So you've got this in the Middle East, Turkmenistan, which was really a part of Persia when it was built in Ashgabat. You have one in the Mother Temple of the West. You have one in Africa. You have one in Australasia or Australia. You have one in Europe. You have one in Central America, in Panama. You have this one in Samoa, which represents the Pacific Islands, because, of course, the king of Samoa was a Baha'i. You have in the Far East, in New Delhi, the Lotus Temple, which is just glorious. Then in South America, we have in Chile, Santiago in 2016. So all of the continents, or most of the continents, are taken care of. Now you have Battambang, Cambodia. Who had ever heard of Battambang? I had not. And then suddenly we get all this news of what's happening, and we get videos of movies of all the teaching happening in Cambodia. And so what do? You build a house of worship there. You put your resources where they will bring forth a harvest, a great harvest. Villarrica, Colombia, in 2018. And then this one, which has been designed but not yet built, in Kenya. So again, now you're getting away from the continental houses of worship, and you're building them in communities that need them and can sustain them. In Vanuatu, in 2021. Well, I hope that proved helpful to you. I know it's reviewing material that most of you probably are well aware of. If you go, if you want a detail about how the plot plays out, you can read my book on the plan of God for planet Earth, which is really assembling all this information in a coherent narrative. If you want to learn even more, then again, I admonish you to read, not to read, but to take all 3 units of Book 8, because they not only deal with the covenant, they deal with the tablets of the divine plan and the particularly important teaching plans that emanate from that divine plan, in particular the 10-year World Crusade, because that's crucial in the development of the covenant, and then the sequence of 5-year plans. Thank you, my friends.